Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the great poet that may sound familiar to you because he wrote his most famous poem about Paul Revere's ride, telling the revolutionists about the British are coming, wrote another poem on Christmas Day, 1863. He wrote this poem during the darkest days of his life. 2 years prior to this, he witnessed his wife that he dearly loved die in a freak fire accident. He was actually there to attempt to put her out as she was aflame, received severe burns on his face that scarred him for the rest of his life. As you might guess from the dates of the poem of 1863, it was a dark time in our nation, right? It was the middle of the brutal Civil War. And he opposed the war, and despite his opposition, one of his sons entered the Union Army. And after months of anxiety and fear about his son's life, he got contacted in November of 63 that his son was alive, even though he had been severely wounded by a gunshot, and that he needed to come and retrieve him from a hospital because he was no longer fit to serve. And on Christmas morning, as was tradition then and still is today for churches that have bells that can be rung, Christmas bells, the church bells were pulled and rang out to celebrate the day. And as Longfellow heard these bells, he eventually wrote these words, saying, "I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And these first two stanzas sound how one might expect a poet to write about the bells that he or she hears on Christmas Day. But then the next few stanzas, Longfellow begins to write about his experience of the darkness of his life and in the world. In stanzas 4 and 5, he writes, "Then from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound, the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And he reaches his bottom, the kind of pit of his despair, in the 6th stanza, as he says, "And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men." And this is perhaps how some of us may feel this morning, right? We're not hearing Christmas bells, but we've been hearing plenty of Christmas songs. We've been seeing plenty of Christmas lights, experiencing plenty of Christmas festivities. And they may seem to us like vain attempts to drown out the sound, the noise of the hate that is so strong that mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And even if you don't perhaps feel despair to that degree, it remains important and good for us to know that others do. It remains good of us to hear their voices, to know their grief, and to combine that with the grief and sadness that is present in our own lives. A seminary professor that I respect recently wrote about this season, and he said, "During these days, we don't go looking for sadness. We merely enact the courage to acknowledge it wherever it appears. There's more than enough to mourn, more than enough to rattle the optimistic cheer of even the most stalwart souls." And that's the truth, right? That there is more than enough to mourn in our lives and in this world. And yet it is into this world that is full of plenty to mourn, this world that is full of hate, that is strong and mocks the song, it is into this world that God's word comes to us. We're still in our Advent series, A Word of Promise, where we recognize that while we wait in this time and space in between Jesus' first coming and his second, that God has given us his very word, which is a word of promise. That we talked about the first week, how it gives us light. And last week we looked at how it directed us to peace. And this week we're going to talk about how it is a word of life, a word that brings life to us and to this world. To do this, we're going to explore this vision that the prophet Ezekiel has and see in it the mourning of Israel and what God brings to those who mourn. And last, the surprise of the present Spirit. So let's look at our text. It's from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. Hear these words from the book that we love. Ezekiel's writing, he says, "The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'Sovereign Lord, you alone know.' Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath into you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain that they may live.' So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord.'" So like most of our texts during the Advent season, this text centers around this reality of Israel being in exile. And this is the emphasis of Advent, that all of us live lives in exile, that we are not in our true home. We are not in the place of our deepest longings. And this is true for the people of Israel in reality in our text. This vision of Ezekiel's takes place in this valley of dry bones. Many people believe that it reflects an actual valley just outside of Israel that Israel would have been marched through as they were being dragged into exile, right? As they were being forcibly displaced, because as we know throughout history and even present day, that if people are displaced, forcefully displaced, not all of them will make it. Right? We know this in stories that we continue to hear of refugees from all over the globe. We know this from our own history as a country, as we displaced indigenous peoples during the Trail of Tears, as we forced some 15,000 Native Americans to leave their homeland for what is present-day Oklahoma. We know that at least 3,500 of them never made it. And that's true of Israel as well, as that many died on their journey going into exile. This vision, however, is about more than those who physically died while traveling. It is about those who feel dead, who feel as if they are in a tomb in exile, who feel, as our text says, that their bones are dry, that they have no hope, that they have been cut off. And the reason why they feel this way is not just because they are in exile, but because they know that they are the cause of them being in exile. Right? We all know that there's a difference in simply, running out of money because jobs are tight, you lost your job unexpectedly, and running out of money because you just made bad financial decisions. Right? We know that there's a difference between being alone because you're new to an area or relationships have always come hard for you, and being alone because you've burned all the bridges of those that God has placed in your life. Now, of course, sometimes we feel in exile because of nothing that we've done. Right? Those of us who've experienced abuse, that's nothing that you've done that has made you feel like you're in exile. Those of us who have received bad medical diagnosis, those of us who have lost loved ones, we feel this pain of exile even though we've done nothing wrong. And yet all of us can think of moments or situations even present in our own life that we're experiencing exile, and we're at least mostly responsible for it. And when we're in that space, we ask the question that Israel asks, that Ezekiel asks, that God asked to Ezekiel, which is, can these bones live? Is there hope for us in this present situation? Will things get better or not? And not surprisingly, perhaps, God's answer is yes. God can and will make these bones live. God's exact promises to them, as we just read, right, is God will open up the tombs that they're experiencing while they're living in exile, bring them to life, bring them back to the land, and give them a new spirit to live in the land once again. And we see right away, for those of us familiar with the Christian story, that this text, like many of our texts in Advent, has a short-term view and a long-term view. Right? In the short term, it is all about Israel and God bringing them out of exile and bringing them home. But in the long term, it's about something much more. It's about what God has always set out to do and has accomplished in Jesus Christ, that God has defeated the last enemy, the great enemy of death itself. Because that's what God has done in Jesus Christ, is he has defeated the great enemy, the last enemy, death. Paul writes about this in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. He writes, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in turn, Christ the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he's destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death." And two big things for us to remember in this description that Paul gives. The first is that our great enemy is death. That the great enemy of every person in this world is death and evil. Right? It is not some country over here or this country over there. It's not some climate issue. It's not some politician. It's not the people who vote and support other politicians. Our great enemy is death itself. And second, the thing to be reminded of or cling to is this reality that God in Jesus Christ has defeated death. And his resurrection is proof of his victory. It is the reason for our hope. That even when we look out and we see in this world still full of darkness and evil and sin, even when we see so many things that reminds us that hate is strong, that mocks the song of peace on earth and goodwill to men, we cling to this truth of this hope that just as Jesus has been raised from the dead, so too will you, even you and I, will be raised just like him in his likeness, because God has defeated the last great enemy of death in Jesus Christ. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has this realization driven into him as he keeps hearing the bells peal on Christmas Day in 1863. In the sixth stanza, he had written, "And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth and goodwill to men." But then he goes on and he writes these words in the final stanza. "Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men." In our world of hate and wrong and death and sin, we cling to this truth that God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong will fail, the right will prevail. Peace on earth and goodwill to all will endure, because God has defeated death in Jesus Christ. Because God does what he always does, which is he brings life to our tombs. God is always bringing life out of the tomb. And the present surprise for us in this text is, as we read it through the lens of what God has done in Jesus, is that we're reminded that we've been given his Spirit. In verses 13 and 14, God speaks through Ezekiel saying, "Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my Spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land." And like many of these texts, we assume that all of this kind of happens at once, but what we see God do in Jesus is this is spread out a little bit. That what God has done in Jesus Christ is that as he died and rose from the grave, we rose with him. We experienced new life in Jesus' resurrection. We see as Jesus, after he rose from the grave, he ascended into heaven, and then he poured out his Spirit on his people. And that's where we are, right? We're people who have received God's Spirit, even though we're not in the promised land of our longing. And so we have this God's Spirit in us, this Spirit that brings life to dry bones in us as we wait for the promised land of our longing. And this Spirit of God does in us what we see it do in our text. Right? It is the Spirit of the Lord that moves Ezekiel into the valley of dry bones. In the same way, God's Spirit moves us to encounter the places of death in our world and in our lives. It is the Spirit of the Lord that we see commanding Ezekiel to proclaim God's truth to these places of death, just as God's Spirit calls us to proclaim God's truth to these places of death. But then there's this odd twist in the text, which is that we also see that we're called to speak God's truth to God's Spirit. See, throughout this text, there are three English words that represent one Hebrew word. Right? The three English words are spirit, breath, and wind. And if we reread the text, you would see that those appear like 9 times, but it's all the same Hebrew word, ruah. And so what we see, and what's fascinating and important to notice, is that life doesn't come to the dry bones until Ezekiel calls on the Spirit to breathe life into them. Right? When Ezekiel just speaks to the dry bones, speaks to bring life to them, they just come together, but they're not alive. It's not until Ezekiel calls on the Spirit, calls on the breath of God to breathe life into them, that they come alive. And for those of us who are Christians, this is a great picture of our vocation in this world today. Yes, we are to be witnesses to the truth of the gospel, right? Telling others what God has done for them and for us and for the whole world and Jesus Christ, how God has defeated the last enemy, death itself, how God brings life to our tombs. And moreover, we're to call on God's Spirit to breathe life into these places of death, to these tombs that are all around us. I began by sharing these words that a seminary professor recently wrote, where he says, During these days, we don't go looking for sadness. We merely enact the courage to acknowledge it wherever it appears. There's more than enough to mourn, more than enough to rattle the optimistic cheer of even the most stalwart souls. And he goes on to say, we entered the long dark night, trusting not our own capacity to rekindle hope or our own ingenuity to overcome our many troubles. We trust the one who has come among us, the one who has become one of us. What wonder. We entrust our hopes and our futures to the one who has taken upon himself all that threatens us, the one who's trustworthy and true. And so when we encounter the death around us, the tombs around us, the more than enough to mourn around us, on one hand, we don't try to entrust ourselves with the ability to figure out, to overcome within ourselves the hate that is strong that mocks the song. We're not called to do that. Nor are we called to turn away from it, to simply turn up the volume on the Christmas songs that we like to hear, to turn on another holiday movie that will make us feel good, pretending as if these things don't exist, hoping that somehow these things will drown out the hate that is so strong, that mocks the song. No, we are to entrust our hopes and our future to the one who has taken upon himself all that threatens us. We're to call on the Spirit of God to bring life into these places of death. And then to step back and see how God is able to once again bring life to the tomb. And we know he's able to do it because the word has come and the word will come again. Let me pray for us.